So it's day 2 of the Judicial Service Commission interviews today. In fact, the kickoff yesterday saw some candidates responding to tough questions from some panelists. In fact, MP Julius Malema asked one of the candidates if he thinks the judiciary can play a role in uniting Africa. The question has drawn focus to discussions around the role that the judiciary can play more broadly to fight several challenges, including poverty, unemployment and corruption. For his take, let's bring in Dennis Davis. He's a retired judge of the High Court of South Africa. Judge Davis joins us via our video link this morning. Great to see you as always, sir. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Interesting question this posed by Julius Malema. And I suppose in part of our reflections, we know that presiding officers are meant to ensure that the law is implemented. Essentially, that's the thrust of their job. But I wonder to what extent they can also be activists while sitting in that seat. In other words, could they drive some kind of ideology if it's in line with their perception of what justice looks like?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I've got two responses to it. Obviously, a judge's makeup, worldview, the way they think about the world, the way they think about legal materials, has an influence on the way in which they judge. When I teach legal theory, to my students at university, one of the first questions I always ask them is, what is the first question an advocate asks when being allocated a case before they get to court? And the answer is, who is the judge? Because obviously, different judges have different perspectives, there's no question. Judges are bound, however, clearly by precedent and by the legal materials, facts and the law which confront them, which means whilst there are different forms of interpretation, different outcomes, it's not a sort of free-for-all, if I could put it that way. Secondly, please remember that our Constitution is ultimately a transformative document, and therefore it's incumbent upon judges to give content to the law in terms of the normative value system of the Constitution, which means ultimately that the law should develop in order to promote the principles of freedom, equality and dignity. And we should be having a very sensible conversation about what that actually means. Right. I mean, there's quite a lot of literature on that, but that's how judges should be, as it were, questioned at the JSC. What do they really mean by that? How do they see that? And not just sort of by giving sort of vague answers, but actually we should be having a serious political intellectual argument about how they see transformation.
Fascinating. You know, in the lead up to at least this round of interviews, there were real concerns about whether or not enough had been done to sharpen the criteria around how these interviews are actually held. And I think you've alluded to that. The line of questioning, for instance, the depths of the interrogation. Are we being rigorous enough? In fact, are we even probing the right aspects of what, you know, these judges have been able to do? It is just day 1 of 8, but what's your take on how that's fed?
Well, that's true. I mean, obviously there are different demands depending on which court you're in. If there are no interviews this time round for the Constitutional Court, that's a whole other issue. But there, you'd really want to probe judges in great depth about how they see law as transforming the society in which we're in, because that was the idea of the whole constitutional journey, which was effectively to ensure that we would move from a society of racist autocracy to non-racial, non-sexist democracy. What does the law do? But has a major contribution to play. In, for example, high courts or the Supreme Court of Appeal, perhaps the standards are slightly different, although in the Supreme Court of Appeal, they deal with a whole range of issues, both constitutional, private law, public law, and there again, one would want to ask judges, to what extent have they sought to develop the law in line with these particular values? How do they see development taking place? And what's their real fundamental conception of transformative constitutionalism? And I mean that in terms of some level of concrete analysis which the public can say, aha, that's where the judge is coming from.
Right. Do you reckon that is possible without judges being upfront about what their ideological standpoint is around some of these issues, in an attempt, of course, to lay bare where they're coming from?
Yes, I mean, you see, when you say the ideological standpoint, we know that the Constitution demands significant legal change. The entire basis of our constitutional democracy was to move the society, as I've suggested to you, from one particular paradigm to another. So whether, in fact, you say that's ideological, that's the most plausible reading of the Constitution which they enjoined to enforce, and not just enforce, but to infuse the whole body of law with those values. So, yes, I think they should be asked questions about this. We want, as it were, our law to make a significant contribution to the development of a society in which 60 million people have substantive citizenship, and the law has a role to play in ensuring we get there. And judges have a significant role to play in that particular process.
Yeah. Speaking about the roles that judges can play, part of the, I guess, more eyebrow-raising moments during those interviews was when one of the candidates, I think it was Mandela Makaula, conceded that he's not necessarily computer literate, and that's why there were some errors in some of his judgments. You've been in the space much longer. How do you reckon that kind of concession ought to land in a context where some people might be, quite disappointed, and that's putting it lightly, that a judge won't be able to do that kind of task? Or do you reckon that's unreasonable?
Well, I don't want to comment about an individual judge. That's not my job here.
Sure.
But I would say two things. I mean, obviously, you're not talking to the most computer literate judge in the world, being me. There are ways around that problem, obviously, if there is that problem. But let me say more generally that judges do work in South Africa with greatly inadequate infrastructure. A computer system that's unreliable, an internet service that doesn't provide them with the kind of resource materials and research materials that they require. I have great deal of sympathy with the fact that judges, as did I, because throughout my career, suffer from a fact that the tools of trade which judges are supposed to have in order to do their work are utterly and completely inadequate.
Absolutely. Okay, that's the, I guess, nuance that many of us had missed. Judge Dennis Davis, I beg your pardon. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate your take as we continue making sense of these JSE interviews. Dennis Davis, of course, a retired judge of the High Court of South Africa.